Hello, this is Jason the Curator. I am back long overdue for a new edition of Comics Corner. And today we are going to be talking about one of the many titles that I've read recently. Especially, it's kind of interesting to look back considering how the DC Universe has now kind of, taken shape and how 10 years ago almost exactly 10 years ago, this comic was not only the standard bearer, but its spin offs were the standard bearer for what would be the DC Universe. And in the process, the DC Universe essentially laid its foundation for the future until the new 52 kind of screwed it all up, and then they had to put the pieces back together. Now, recently, DC has fell on some hard times. They had to let go of several of uh, their top brass via reassignment or firing. Diane Nelson was removed from her position at DC as the president. And a lot of this has to do, of course, with the failures in the box offices of Justice League and Batman versus Superman and a lot of the other stuff that basically wasn't named Wonder Woman. You then also have, on the other hand, Jeff Johns. Probably, if not my favorite writer in comics, he's probably one of my top writers in comics. The guy who pretty much almost single-handedly reinvented the wheel on Green Lantern and basically created the mythos that you now know and love about the character. He's the one who, well, I'm sure he didn't really create, the basics for every single one of like the Lantern Corps that we now have in the DC universe. He was one of the minds that brought it all together, and I applaud him for that because honestly, Blackest Night, I've said this on several occasions, is one of my favorite books of all time. I don't care if it's got some plot holes and it's a bit nonsensical and it doesn't all add up towards the end. And even the sequel, Brightest Day, which I haven't read everything about, I really liked. Another great book that Jeff Johns wrote was, along with several others, was 52. 52 was a year-long maxi series, as it was called, that spanned across the DC universe, and it took place after Infinite Crisis, which I liked. I liked Infinite Crisis. It didn't beat the original Chaos or Crisis on Infinite Earths rather, but it definitely was strong in and of its own right, and actually as a sequel told a very good story. It had its plot holes and its flaws, but at the very end of the book, to make a long story short, because we're not here to talk about 52 or Infinite Crisis today, we're here instead to talk about what happened afterwards. But the basic gist of what happens during 52 is that it's split across multiple characters. But the premise is simple. After Infinite Crisis, after the whole ordeal is over, Batman and Wonder Woman retire, along with Superman, who temporarily loses his powers, which, believe me, is about the simplest explanation I can give to the setup for 52 than without overcomplicating things. What basically then goes on is several characters that would be considered side characters in like the Batman books or the Wonder Woman books or the Superman books. They get their focus, they get their time to shine. Characters like Booster Gold, The Question, who is, in my opinion, one of the more underrated characters in DC's entire lineup in terms of heroes. You've got a whole bunch of other interesting little side stories that all kind of tie in to many of those characters. Black Adam, a longtime villain in the book, actually gets reformed, forms a new family, if I can talk, and as a result, it just kind of, he becomes less of a dictator, and there's a lot to digest in 52. I recommend reading it if you are a long-term fan of the DC Universe. Just note that if you have not read Infinite Crisis and you don't know what happened in Infinite Crisis, a lot of the stuff for 52 is going to seem very very, very strange and foreign to you. Now, with that said, this would also be this was a great success for DC. It started in May of 2006, and it actually ran a full year. Now there were tie-ins, but for the most part they were just tie-ins in the sense that they kind of ran alongside the main books that were still ongoing at the point. It wasn't like where an event takes over the comics company and it becomes the focal point of everything that the company is doing, like, say, your Secret Wars, your Blackest Nights, your Brightest Days, those kinds of things. Now, unfortunately, the next time they tried this whole thing with 52, except, with the editors kind of at the helm in Countdown to Final Crisis, yeah, it did not work nearly as well. The same formula was there, but it was done with a lot less, cohesion and sense. And to be perfectly honest, it's amazing that the 5 writers that actually contributed to 52 were not able only to keep this going for, a year, but they also contributed heavily to the tie-in books, the very few tie-in books. Now, believe it or not, while 52 is not about any one major character throughout its entirety, there are a couple that take the forefront, and in particular, it's Black Adam and his family and his, potential reformation that kind of takes the forefront of this. That, and also this very interesting little side story involving a very, very silly named villain named Egg Fu, or Chang Zhu, and he literally has all of these scientists, all of these mad scientists from the DC universe trying to essentially get back at Black Adam because Black Adam broke out of a treaty with a whole bunch of other, dictatorships and fascist nations, or ones that had evil leaders, quote unquote. And basically, he has the scientists, along with doing various other, questionable things in trying to, bend the laws of time and space and, science and stuff. You got a whole bunch of them, by the way. Heck, you even get the creator of the Metal Men and the Doom Patrol somehow roped into this scenario too. And in the end, however, it's actually a Wonder Woman villain named Veronica Cale. Now, she is in many ways according to Greg Rucka, the creator of her, who created her in 2003, she was basically designed to be a Lex Luthor for Wonder Woman. I don't necessarily mind that. I think that Wonder Woman's got plenty of good villains, but I do think that it could be an intriguing take. As a result, Veronica Cale is one of those people that, in the superhero, the terms of superheroes, she doesn't have powers. She doesn't really have gimmicks. Her big gimmick is her intelligence and, with the whole idea of this, super secret scientist, mad scientist island, the bankroll. And here's where things kind of get a little interesting. Now, towards the later end of 52, like the second half, so Black Adam has his family. He's making better for his people in I can never say that correctly. I'm just going to assume that people who have followed Black Adam know what I'm talking about, and I apologize for butchering the name. Kondak. But anyways, so Black Adam and his new wife, his new lover, who takes the name Isis. Hey, it was 2006, by the way. Don't jump down my throat. That's the character's name. And also, Isis is the name of an Egyptian goddess. So, yeah, you can argue that they didn't know any better at the time, especially when you consider that Black Adam himself derives his powers from the Egyptian pantheon of gods. So, of ancient Egypt, I should say. So, yeah. And then her Isis has a little brother named who later goes on to be named Osiris. When they find Osiris, they also happen to find Sobek, this gorilla or this gator human hybrid who they take in as kind of a pet. Unbeknownst to them, however, this is all part of Veronica Cale and Egg Fu, and yes, I am just going to call him Egg Fu. I know he's technically called Chang Zhu, but I prefer Egg Fu because it's just sillier and it fits comics far more. Because Sobek is actually possessed by one of the Four Horsemen of the Apokolips, and when I mean Apocalypse, I mean the planet that Darkseid comes from. Yeah, the new gods. Now, granted, they are the same as the traditional biblical Horsemen of the Apocalypse. You know, war, famine, pestilence, and death. Really, I struggled on death. That's terrible. But yeah, they're based on that, and they're basically, you know, they carry these really cool, super souped up, badass forms that I really like the character designs for them. But essentially, yes, Veronica Cale resurrects the Four Horsemen of the Apokolips to bring down Black Adam. It only sort of kind of works because Sobek ends up eating Osiris in a very, very grisly scene from 52. And then while they manage to kill Sobek, Black Adam and Isis manage to kill Sobek, they are unable to subdue Pestilence and War, who attack them. In fact, Pestilence infects Isis with a disease that's pretty much fatal to her, and she manages to take out Pestilence with a lightning bolt with the last of her powers, and basically tells Black Adam to forget all of the reformation that she had encouraged him to go on, and that his way, which might I add was, you know, a very eye for an eye, you know, iron fist rule, that that way of justice is correct. So aka Black Adam should abandon trying to be the higher being, the higher guy, if you will, because of his powers, and instead just, you know, punish the wicked that do wrong to him. And it's kind of muddied, but for the most part, 52 kind of goes on, this way. And what kind of occurs throughout it is that Black Adam actually goes on a revenge spree, and he actually does manage to wipe out the Four Horsemen of the Apokolips. Or so he thinks. Now, the other thing that's worth noting is that he actually does have a chance to kill Veronica Cale. He actually tracks them to Oolong Island, which is an isolated Polynesian or island in the Pacific that later becomes its own little sovereign nation for the mad scientists at Veronica Cale's behest. But the problem is that Black Adam essentially has the opportunity to kill Veronica Cale, and he doesn't do it. And then this all leads to this whole rampage, which leads to him striking the fictional African military dictatorship Biala, or Bihala, I believe it's pronounced, one or the other, which essentially kind of is, I don't know which African military state it kind of is meant to mimic, but, you know, I think you could just take your pick if you read it, and if you know anything about the history of the region in recent years. But yeah, he goes to war and he wipes out the entire population. He puts 2 million people in the ground and, you know, basically ruinates the entire rest of the nation, to the point where all of the heroes in the DC universe have to come and try and stop him in an event that is so cataclysmic that it is a side story or a tie-in to 52 called World War III. And they managed to subdue Adam, but not without suffering heavy losses and damages. Now, granted, the heroes that do die in this thing in World War III are not necessarily, you know, characters of grand importance or anything like that, but the losses are severe. And Adam just barely, just barely manages to escape with his life and basically goes into hiding, almost ashamed of what he's done, but at the same time, having accomplished his vengeance against the Horsemen. Again, or so he thinks. There was another tie-in, a conclusion, aftermath story written by one of the primary writers for 52, Keith Giffen, who was another great writer, by the way, simply called The Four Horsemen. Now, at this point in the 52 timeline, Superman has regained his powers, and no, I couldn't tell you how it happened because I think it occurred in either the World War III, books which I haven't read, or it occurred in some other tie-in to 52, like maybe the Superman main books, which I didn't keep up with at the time, and therefore I have no idea, when he got them back. But he, Wonder Woman, and Batman are all in Biala trying to help the people. That Bruce is trying to use Wayne Enterprises to actively give food, water, and some shelter to the refugees. Clark Kent's there reporting on the story, talking to the reigning dictator of the country, who is basically turning it into a military state where nobody can enter and nobody can leave. That's like, a natural born citizen, if you will. And Wonder Woman, I don't even know how she really ends up in Biala. She really actually ends up just going after Veronica Cale at first because she got a tip of some kind. I don't even really know how she gets to Veronica. I mean, I can't even really explain how she gets to Veronica Cale on Oolong Island. She just kind of does. But basically confronts her there and realizes that, she's up to no good, but she can't really pinpoint it until then. Basically, however, they do know that the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse were unleashed by Cale, and that the shady things that Cale was doing basically put the entire world at jeopardy, and that Adam's actions could be traced back to them. Like I said, however, Veronica Cale somehow managed to secure diplomatic immunity, which means that they can't touch the people on Oolong Island, even though they do manage to get the Justice Society's Mr. Terrific actually to kind of, and Checkmate in particular, to kind of work with them and try and stabilize the whole thing. Oh yeah, Checkmate. That's a secret government organization that apparently is kind of in the same vein as the Suicide Squad, except it's not really metahumans so much as it is government agents with, unlimited impunity. Yeah, I know. It's kind of weird. Checkmate actually has its own very long, very torrid history that I don't even want to get into here. Now, the Four Horsemen storyline, like I said, it picks up in kind of the aftermath of World War III, the DC comic World War III. And it's a 5-issue miniseries. And I have to admit, I really like the idea and the concept. Now, admittedly, it's kind of weird, and it comes kind of out of nowhere. It's not really explained. The whole story kind of gets set up with 4 random people who each represent something cruel or something that kind of embodies the 4 horsemen, war, death, famine, and pestilence. And as a result, these random 4 people, they somehow become possessed by the horsemen's essences, which is not something I knew they could do. I mean, I thought that the only reason why Sobek was possessed was because Veronica Cale deliberately implanted Sobek's personality into, or Famine's personality into Sobek, and then, basically let it run hog wild, while the rest of them had their own individual bodies and chassis, and they do. They end up rebuilding their cyborg augmented god forms from Apokolips in the comic itself. So it's not like they're completely, unaware of their true forms and they don't know what they're doing there. In fact, in many ways, their plan is basically to try and, build up their strength and then take out the one person who basically could imprison them, aka Veronica Cale, because, well, well, it would be a very bad and stupid mad scientist move if you had no way to, no kill switch for the indestructible, unstoppable death machines, or the Four Horsemen of Apokolips, or basically any sort of doomsday weapon that you try to create to wipe out superheroes. The huge. Basically, the whole thing then kind of breaks down with Superman getting attacked by hunger while meeting Batman, and hunger or famine actually bites Superman on the arm and actually infects him with his essence. So that's kind of a running theme throughout the entire book, that Superman could technically be possessed by famine at some point. And he later does, but Wonder Woman beats it out of him. So he ends up living, of course, because it's Superman. Batman, meanwhile, he actually ends up getting possessed too later on by Pestilence in a fight with him, but he, of course, recovers because, well, it's Batman. The real intrigue kind of comes from Wonder Woman, and also comes from Veronica Cale, because Wonder Woman actually works with the Doom Patrol, a group of superheroes that kind of, sort of, depending on your interpretation, they're either led by a villain and a complete sociopath in Dr. Miles Calder, or they're heroes that just so happen to follow Calder because he's got the tech that they don't know how to use or something. Because that's kind of what it amounts to. But yeah, basically, the dead start to rise, and no, not like Black Lanterns, but essentially zombies start to rise. The government fighting forces can't handle it, and Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, the crux of the book is that they spend most of it teaming up to try and take down the resurrected Horsemen. Which is kind of hilarious, because when you think about how powerful Black Adam is and all the chaos and trouble and destruction he caused, and the fact that it is stated in the book that he did kill them, the fact that they were able to come back means that, oh boy, somebody must have screwed up. Either Dr. Calder wasn't aware that they could revive, or the kill switch was never implemented. In fact, it's kind of funny because we do get cameos from a lot of other characters some of whom actually just kind of feel like random and out of place. Like, there's actually this one character who's super annoying to the point where even Batman, he just goes out of his way to say, shut up, multiple times, not because he's being dark and broody, but because he's annoyed by him. The character's name, you're going to love this, by the way. His name is Snapper Carr. He was a very, very annoying stooge or sidekick, non-powered human that was actually around with the Justice League back during its original foundation. He was basically just this annoying, lackey little sidekick character who eventually became an honorary member of the Justice League, even though he had no powers and he never really contributed anything to the group. But he was made a member, and now in this version of events, he's actually a deep cover operative for Checkmate, monitoring metahumans after everything that happened with World War III. The whole Black Adam debacle. So, if anything else, yes, Snapper Carr has simultaneously gone from being a very stupid character to a very annoying character that somehow has even more credibility and arguably has more storytelling potential than even Jimmy Olsen, Superman's photographer pal, who, by the way, surprisingly isn't even in this, probably because they had to get ready for giving him all the superpowers and Countdown when the new gods started dying left and right. Yippee. Yeah, it's kind of embarrassing to think that, they could have, of all the characters that they could have included, it's amazing how dignified some of them come across, and then you realize, oh yeah, Countdown was not very far behind this. And no, Keith Giffen was not one of the writers on Countdown, nor was Jeff Johns or any of the original writers, really. I mean, there were good writers, but, well, Countdown just was not very good. Anyways, So yeah, Snapper Carr basically is there to kind of be like a plot info dump, and also to kind of not be useless, which is actually kind of insulting. His presence is actually kind of insulting because it feels like a random like plot reveal, plot twist, like, ooh, who's this guy? And if you don't really know anything about the Justice League or every single side character, you, like me, probably would have missed who the hell Snapper Carr even is. Hell, they don't even say his last name, but if you know anything about, like I said, the JLA or the Justice League in general and their history, you'll figure it out pretty quickly, and you'll be like, really? This is who they brought back? This was their supply. This was a surprise reveal that they thought would work. I know Keith Giffen was probably thinking, well, let's see. Maxwell Lord got killed by Wonder Woman before 52 began. Who the heck do I even want to maybe make as the mobile face of Checkmate? I don't know. We'll throw in Snapper Carr. I joke, but I'm sure Keith Giffen probably did have a good reason for it. I just wish I felt that I could figure it out myself. Anyways, the reason why it's kind of insulting is because, as I mentioned before, Mr. Terrific is both a member of the Justice Society and Checkmate. He's basically there to watch Checkmate and make sure they don't try anything shady. Not to mention, Batman also has the Martian Manhunter within Checkmate as an operative. So, yeah, Snapper Carr being there feels really redundant to the point where it's just kind of there for a plot twist because he doesn't really contribute anything to the plot other than acknowledging what we kind of already could figure out if we put two and two together. The idea that Veronica Cale was the one who resurrected the Horsemen, that the Horsemen are basically the ones causing all the chaos and mischief, and that Snapper's basically there to monitor Superman, Wonder Woman, and Batman for no other reason than Checkmate is apparently deciding to be very, very shady in how they do business, or something of that effect. Basically, the fights in this whole thing are pretty good, if a little bit underwhelming. Famine and War kind of really don't put up nearly as much of a fight. I mean, sure, War actually ends up taking the fight to Oolong Island and actually ends up pretty much just annihilating the compound, but it's all over once Wonder Woman and the Doom Patrol both go after him at the same time. The same thing with Famine. Hell, the most interesting fight is actually Batman and Pestilence, mostly because the dialogue and Batman's intelligence really shines through. But if nothing else, it just proves that, yes, Keith Giffen knows what he's doing when he's writing these iconic characters. The whole dynamic with Superman and the infection of famine into his veins is another interesting idea, but I feel like they rush it a little much. Like, Superman is shown fighting the infection and, actually, winning against it in many ways, but we never really see any potential that he is going to turn. We never see him attacking any innocent civilians out of some sort of deranged hunger like you would expect. So it feels almost like they chucked a bit of an opportunity to maybe have a single issue where the heroes were falling to the influence of the Horsemen, and instead just decided to rush things along. Not a bad way of doing things, of course. I just feel like the pacing was definitely keeping up a very good solid pace, but it wouldn't have been hurt had an additional issue been made to kind of, pad out or make the whole experience feel a little bit better. The whole thing has a very, very, very weird ending, in my opinion. So basically what happens is Death ends up being the last Horseman standing and ends up directly confronting Veronica Cale. Now, Cale has created a countermeasure to seal away the Horsemen, but the problem is that without extra time, the countermeasure has to be a proximity one. And basically what happens is that Veronica Cale ends up ingesting the capture mechanism and basically has to get close to each and every single one of the Horsemen to capture their essence inside of her. Yeah, it's weird, but it works. And basically, what ends up happening then is that they end up capturing Death. War is broken down. Both War and Pestilence are broken down to the point where, or I should say, Famine and Pestilence are broken down to the point where they're actually in isolation chambers. Um, when Death is defeated, and Batman, transfers them over to Oolong Island for containment. So basically, you have War I'm sorry, I'm getting a little confused. So you basically have three of the Four Horsemen, incapacitated, and then you have one of them that's essentially, inside Superman, who gets, his essence absorbed, and then Batman, when one of the essences takes him over, that basically seals inside of him, and then Veronica Cale manages to somehow, some way, hold them off, or hold the presences off from overriding them, by capturing them and basically saving the day. Now, I will say this, the issue ends on a bit of a cliffhanger with Veronica Cale basically saying, hey, get this device out of me before the superheroes decide that our sovereignty of Oolong Island is no longer a sovereign nation, and they actually decide to take us out. Because by the end of it, it's like Oolong Island is granted a bit of a reprieve, but their democratic immunity and diplomatic immunity is in the air at best. And given everything that's happened, it's not like Veronica Cale is in any real position to do anything, other than try to get the ship right back on track. She is, by the way, the president of this little mini nation, throughout the entire thing. So, what she says kind of goes. She basically then orders the villain IQ to basically create a team and a device to extract the containment device, out of her body, so that they could basically, either ship the Horsemen back to Apokolips and get them out of there entirely, or, and this is probably more likely, get them out of the containment device out after it's out of Veronica Cale, and somehow, some way, try to find a way to control them, even though that is very, very unlikely. And unfortunately, maybe, I don't know if it was because Countdown was trying to tell so many different stories, and it was like this year-long event, and they had their own tie-ins planned, or if, 52 itself, like the whole, like the whole kind of high of everything was over, and like this was kind of a nice little wrap-up to a lot of other plot threads. But the whole thing with Veronica Cale and the Horsemen isn't really brought up much in comics afterwards. Now, granted, Veronica they do get the Horsemen extracted from outside of her, but they never really show up again in comics, at least not recently in anything of note. So that's a little bit of a bummer. Meanwhile, Veronica Cale herself was one of the many, many victims of the New 52 reboot. She still has much in the same way of her personality and persona and her skirmishes with Wonder Woman, but for the most part, a lot of her other, of course, character backstory and her other villainous deeds have kind of been sort of lost to the ether, at least until Rebirth, where they tried to once again retie and reconnect all the old threads once again, which, doesn't always work, or hasn't always worked as well as it could have. But basically, this was kind of a nice little conclusionary story to one of the more intriguing little arcs of 52, or probably one of the defining arcs of 52. This wouldn't actually be the end of everything that occurred in 52 in regards to this. It was actually a nice little side story in Blackest Night, and Black Adam himself would actually become a relatively minor yet important figure in 52, to the point where he would actually hide in New York City in an abandoned building, only to end up giving his Black Marvel powers to Mary Marvel or Adam powers to Mary Marvel of the Marvel family, and turning her evil as a result. Yeah, that is, and it's probably one of the worst villain turns ever. As for Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman, what else really needs to be said? They did what they do best, save the world, and pretty much this story was one of those rare team ups where they didn't have to fight everything, because they had to fight every single, major villain. Like they didn't have to fight Darkseid and his generals. They just had to fight four random people from Apokolips, and it wasn't easy, but they got it done. Like I said, there are some flaws with the story. Snapper Carr's inclusion is really just It's like, okay, why is Snapper Carr there? What is his purpose? There's also a couple scenes regarding Calculator, a technological broker who works often for villains, who basically is told by Veronica Cale and paid by Veronica Cale to hide up and hush up any government information or any news leaks from Biala regarding the dead rising and all the other, destruction and chaos, which goes about as well as a single, maybe couple pages later, Checkmate and the Justice Society and Batman and company, all of them pretty much know what's going on. In fact, the only reason why Batman and company don't even call for reinforcements from any of the other organizations is because they don't want to cause more international incident and problem. They're basically doing it because they're the boots on the ground already, and if they really need to call reinforcements, well, then that just speaks to how bad the situation would or could have gotten. But for the moment, they decide to handle it like, the mainstream heroes that they are, and they get the job done. Like I said, there's a lot of other loose threads that kind of feel like they're unfinished by the book, like Checkmate's connection. The future of Oolong Island hangs in the balance and is never really resolved, or at least not in a satisfying way that I've read personally. I'm sure that I will be corrected on this, but in the end, I say for a 5-issue miniseries based on a post-event of the maxi series that was 52, which I do recommend. I recommend 52. It's amazing. I'd say this is okay. It's actually pretty good. Keith Giffen does a great job writing the art, and all of the other writing is very well paced and very well done. It's not a must-own for your comics collection, unless you really, really liked 52 and therefore you want to own all the tie-ins. If you're looking for a nice little one-shot miniseries to read, really the only thing that you need to know is the information that I gave you regarding Black Adam and his whole family and how the Horsemen of the Apokolips came to be in this particular scenario. And once you know that, the rest of it's actually kind of pretty easy to understand. I mean, granted, it does help to have all the additional information that you can find or, have prior knowledge of the whole event. But, it's not one of those comics where you need to read everything that came before it to understand what's going on. It's a nice, simple, if albeit at times creepy and effective story that really makes three of the biggest superheroes of our era, of our time, if not all time, look like the badasses they are truly meant to be, and proves that despite what mainstream movies and, even at times comics will have you believe, these three can work together and they can form a team that can conquer all. Also, having the Doom Patrol show up and be, nice little reinforcements was a nice little nod, especially considering that the Doom Patrol is one of probably the more underrated superhero teams. And yes, they are a superhero team despite the name. You would think that that would probably work better as a villain name, but yeah, they're a superhero team. Anyways, I would like to thank you all for listening. This has been episode 81, and I know I took a really long time getting anywhere in terms of recording this. It's not that I didn't have stuff to read or talk about. I did, but life gets in the way, as we all know. Hopefully you enjoy this and you keep coming back for more. Invite your friends, and I hope to see you next time on Comics Corner.